So, uh, good evening. So, last class we ended on this lecture where we were looking at initial considerations to take note of when designing or phrasing questionnaires. And we said one of them was, we ended there. So, we want to continue from here to wrap up this particular topic. So one of them is the type of information required. We need to be very mindful of the type of information required. And the type of information required will determine the sequencing of the questionnaire. Um, there are sensitive questions that when asking, you want to also know where to place it. For example, my experience in designing questionnaires or sorry of carrying out questionnaires is that it has been when you ask sensitive questions like what is your income, people always shy away from answering that question, or what is your age, especially for us in Africa, because they are considered sensitive questions. You'd want to put them at the tail end of the questionnaire, because if you ask that question at the beginning, somebody may just say, no, I'm no longer answering this question. But at least if you ask all the questions and the person gets comfortable, then somewhere you may ask below. But you must be very sure, beyond that the information is sensitive, that all the information that you require is in the survey. So you don't want to start and then collect all the data, go to the analysis table, and then discover that you left out some information. Then you have to go back. So generally, you must be sure of the information that is required, the type and nature of that information, the type and nature of the respondents. You must be very sure. Are you asking firm owners? Are you asking individuals? Are you asking homes? If you're asking homes, what is your definition for a home? Is it, because in data collection, a home is not necessarily a building. A home is not a building. A home is defined by two things. One, the decision making, whether the people living in the house are answerable to the same decision making process, or by income, whether they are eating from the same pot. That's the simple way I can describe it. So, four university students who live in the same building, for example, who are just who came together and they're paying and living in the same building are not necessarily the same household. Those are four households living in one building. So you need to define your respondents very clearly. The type and method by which survey is to be administered. You must be very sure whether it's phone interview or what do you call it? Questionnaires, or it's focus group, or it's personal interview, key respondents, and so on and so forth. So, in terms of the question content, you must also be sure of the relevance of a question. One thing is clear, as you would see as we discuss, that you don't want your questionnaire to be too long. So, because you don't want it to be too long, you want to ask only very relevant questions that will help in determining what that particular thing that you're trying to investigate. So you want to get that thing very clearly. So you ask questions that will get you to the solution of your problem. Avoid ambiguous questions. This cannot be overemphasized. The problem with ambiguous questions is that once you ask ambiguous questions, it now needs further interpretation in the field. So if you have 5 enumerators and you have asked an ambiguous question, they when administering it in the field, they are not together, remember? So each person that is administering, or even if they are in group, each group that is administering will be interpreting that question further. And now that brings subjectivity, because they may not even have the same understanding. Even when they have been to a training, they may not have the same understanding. So it now subjects the response to that question to the interpretations of the enumerators, which now creates a problem. Then when you get the result, you see that the responses are not aligning because some seem to answer a completely different question altogether. Ability and willingness of respondents to answer. You must also confirm that from the beginning. Usually in the introduction section, there is that question that asks the individual to give consent to the question. And that question, beyond just the ethical process of getting consent, it also helps in a way because what you come to understand is that when somebody says, I am willing to give consent, I give consent to answering this question, then they are more likely to stay to the end of the questionnaire, even when you come to those sensitive questions. So it's very important to get the willingness of the respondents to consent and then try to get the willingness of them to respond to the questions, which in itself requires a skill. Questionnaire handling is an art and it requires a skill. There will be people who go to the field and they keep having returned questionnaires. And then there will be others, because of their charm, because of their dressing, because of their ability to win the crowd or win the person that they're talking to, because of their ability to explain the relevance of the questionnaire, they now tend to have more responses because they are able to convince the respondents to answer to the questions. Questionnaire phrasing. Yes, we have said the questions should be short and straightforward, clear, no ambiguous questions. Style and appropriate to target population. You must understand the target population and be very careful with the words you use because different different cultures will be sensitive to different words, and you want to be very careful not to touch on people's sensibility. So you must understand your target population and be sure that that target population is the right target population for that particular study. It may be for another study, but for that one that you are doing, is it the right target population? I've talked about clear and ambiguous. I've talked about avoiding biased words and leading questions. That's very important. So you don't want to preempt the respondent to ask questions like, why is it that access to credit does not reduce poverty? That way, you'd be you'd be that way you'll be giving an answer to a question that you have not asked because you're already telling the respondents that access to credit should is not reducing poverty and you are just asking why. Rather, if you even want to ask that question, you should start with, to what extent does access to poverty, does access to finance reduce poverty, before you now have follow-up questions to that. So you want to avoid leading questions as much as possible. Avoid negative questions. So there's an order in which you ask questions. Yeah, this point says avoid negative questions, but the bigger logic is avoid asking questions that are both negative and positive. So if you want to ask questions that are positive leaning, you ask positive leaning questions. Because if you mix them and the analyst does not know that they are positive and negative leaning questions, it may completely destroy the analysis. Let's take, for example, um, the question, to what extent does access to finance reduce poverty, is different from how do I phrase the negative one now? Does access to finance is not reducing poverty? To what extent does access to finance is not reducing poverty? Just for the sake of the example. It doesn't sound right, yeah, but just to make you understand that those two questions will demand different responses. So if one is saying strongly agree, then they are saying strongly agree to the positive leaning part. If one is saying strongly disagree, they are saying strongly disagree to the negative leaning part. So, and if you ask, because you want to get a perspective, and then you're asking different sub questions of a particular theme, and some of the sub questions are negative leaning, some are positive leaning, then you find that by the time you now want to understand the theme as a whole, you would have issues with biasness. So the one set may be diminishing the effect of the other. Yeah. Discourage guessing. You don't want to guess. Of course, even when you have questions on perception, you don't want them to be guessing. You want them to answer from, you give them time to think and answer, not just to say, I think it is, you want them to answer from a place of consciousness so that you're sure that at least it speaks to what you're trying to investigate. Do not assume anything for granted from the part of the respondent. Do not assume that they understand anything. Do not preempt them, like I said. So even in the questionnaire, you want to be having small tips or notes to explain some concepts, but of course, you don't also want to overdo that, because you overdo it, it makes the questionnaire again long or too technical. So you have to have a balance between having a very clear and concise questionnaire and making sure that every detail is understood as per the intention. Now, looking at the types of response format of questions, we have a couple of them. We have dichotomous questions where you simply answer yes or no. You have multiple choice questions where you have several options, and then you may or may not have a neutral point. Strongly agree, agree, neutral, disagree, something like that. Which also, that what I've just said is known as a Likert scale, but a Likert scale is also a multiple choice question. But not all multiple choice questions are Likert scales. You can have a multiple choice question which is what kind of internet do you use, for example, and somebody is saying, I use mobile broadband, I use Wi-Fi, I use whatever. So you have different options, but it's not necessarily a Likert scale in that case. Importance scale, another type of multiple choice, but here you're just asking the importance of a particular thing. To what extent is this important? Strong is very important or very significant, strongly not important, very important, which also now becomes a Likert scale. Rating scale is simply rating a performance or whatever thing that you're trying to assess in terms of excellence. So excellence, not so, or good, very good, good, poor, and so on. So the different kinds of questions also could be, when you have open-ended questions, you have questions that are completely unstructured, because once you ask an open-ended question, the question has no limitation, unlike the closed-ended questions formats we have just seen. The question has no frame, such that you can ask, uh, how does access to finance affect poverty? And then you find everybody responding their own way, coming from different angles, and which makes it a bit difficult to analyze. Word association. So you want to be sure, when you ask an open-ended question, the first word that comes to mind may be what they will answer. And that's why you have to be careful even when phrasing the topic, so that the question rather, so that the question does not relay a particular answer when the intention is another one. Because when somebody hears a question, they're tempted to think of of something, and if the question is open-ended, they can now just answer in that direction, even when that's not really what you're looking for. You want to open-ended have sentences that are not necessarily complete because of its nature. It's open-ended. Story completion. Once you're asking open-ended questions, be sure that people will respond with stories. In fact, once you go to the field, you have all kinds of experiences. So people would narrate stories, and you want to be careful not to stop them midway because it may affect their sensibilities. They may decide not to answer further again, especially when you're talking, when the topic is very sensitive. People want to narrate and narrate and narrate. And so, the extent to which their, their narration is complete is important to the extent that it's relevant to your question. Because even when you're doing your data analysis, you want to summarize all that, but you want to be sure that what is being the response is complete. What was the cause? What was was there an example? And what did the person do with the problem? So something like that. Picture completion. You want to fill in balloons. You want to fill in or any kind of picture that represents what the message you're trying to convey. The balloons is just an example, but especially when you're asking questions to non-educated people, you want to make it as reader friendly as possible so that they can answer. But the picture completion also helps to be a question in itself, because sometimes you may just show a picture and say, are people facing, or you ask a question right now, I can't think of one, ask a question that is related to a particular picture that you have in your questionnaire, and people answer it as an open-ended question. Thematic perception, the thematic perception test. So it's similar to the picture completion, but here you have a phrasing, a subject where you want to test their perspective. And for example, you even start from you can ask from the definition of that subject or concept. And you want people to respond in relation to how they understand the concepts. So in that case, you're basically testing their thinking, you're testing their perception about that particular theme. And of course, by the nature of that, you're asking an open-ended question altogether. Question sequencing is very important, because if you're doing, for example, a quota sampling method like we saw in the last class, then you want to have questions that will control those quotas from the beginning. Let's say you want 40% female and 60% male. Because of the nature of maybe the population itself, the population is 40% male and 60% female. Then it means that one of your first questions should be gender, so that once you ask gender and you get one, you note. So when you're filling the questionnaires and going, you're making sure that those quota control questions are guiding you to ultimately get to your target, where you have 40% of your sample male and 60% of your sample female. And it gets even more complicated when you have other characteristics in that quota system. So you may have gender, you may have firms, you want to ask questions where firms, you have different categories of firms, small, medium, large. You may have difference according to districts. That one is easier, because once the questionnaires that you take to a particular district or local government is what you use. And then interest, reassurance, and forte. So you want to also ask some preliminary questions that will lead to the ultimate question. In as much as you're interested in a particular question, We want to ask questions around that question, which would give the respondent some kind of pre-taste of the questions that will come. But also those questions are very important because they help you to further understand the main question. Because when you ask those questions, when you're interpreting and you have some very unexpected responses, then you can say, oh, maybe this is because of this and that, given the information that were asked before that. Logical order, very important. Which question should come first? Which one should come before the other? You don't just ask questions. And I've said one of the guide of this logical order is when you have sensitive questions. And even when you ask, even when the logical order dictates that the sensitive questions should come before others, because even when I have a questionnaire, if I'm administering a questionnaire, the order, the questions would determine the way I ask them. If I perceive that the logical order that has been put is not working, especially when you're in the field, then I may have to rearrange the order for me, not necessarily in the questionnaire, so that it flows. And when I ask some questions, even number, I may skip number 5 question and then ask it at the end because of the logical order. So you want to have that arrangement from the questionnaire so that you don't give that responsibility to the enumerator. Avoid questions which suggest an answer to later questions, because when you ask questions that suggest an answer, then you're already you're defeating the aim of that last of the later question. So yes, you want questions. What we advise, you want to ask questions that double check other questions, because sometimes people, especially when you're dealing with perception questions, people do not really, people just answer, not keeping track of what they said, and that's a good way of measure of testing whether the question is really answered from a place of consciousness. But that the question or the control questions should not suggest later answers to other questions. It should be questions that have their own answers, and they'll answer the other questions without any bias to the previous responses. Questionnaire layout, you want to have a good quality paper. The formatting, the neatness, the clarity, the print of the questions should be very neat and appealing to the respondent. Questions should be as short as possible. You don't want your questions too long, but you don't also want it too short, because too short means you will not ask some of those control questions. You will not understand, for example, the socio-demographic characteristics of the respondent. So too short is also a problem, but too long is even a bigger problem, because you may end up not having responses altogether. And there are some of these questionnaires you come across that are 15 pages, 25 pages, and even you, the respondents, going through one question paper is a big deal. And then when you have vested interest, probably you're being paid, then imagine the person who is not being paid. So you want to have questions that are as short as possible. You can use lines, boxes, pictures to make your questionnaire look more appealing, or how to respond. They tick boxes, or they write on lines, or they maybe choose between pictures, or they just interpret the picture, and so on. Instructions should be kept to a minimum. Very important. You just want to have a 2-3 liner at that beginning that explains what the questionnaire is all about, and that explains then 1 or 2 lines that explains the instructions, so that you also don't have, because it's so many pages. So if you have few questions and your instructions fill the remaining pages and takes the questionnaire to 5-6 pages, just the number of pages, even when the questions are few, would could also discourage respondents. Purpose of survey explained by at the beginning. Very true. That introduction. You want to explain why you're doing that survey, and that will go a long way to even convince the respondents to stay and answer all the questions that you would want them to answer, which will be beneficial to you. What is to be done with the completed questionnaire? What ultimately, when you finish, what do you want to do? Do you want to advise the government? Do you want to publish a paper? Do you want to use it for a master's thesis? Or so ultimately, you want to tell the students, or sorry, the respondents, what the questionnaire outcome will be. So, in finalizing a questionnaire, you want to minimize fault as much as possible. So, if there are any misprints, you want to take it out. Typographical or whatever grammatical mistakes, you want to take it out. The relevance of the questions must be clearly noted. You have to go through, delete questions that are not relevant, because you want to keep the questions as concise as possible. Then the expected range of answers. So even when you have open-ended questions, you can afford to guide them so that the questions are not just flying, the responses are not just flying all over the place. When you guide them, you're able to 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 create a range, as it were, of responses or answers to those to the question that has been asked. Of course, for close-ended questions, it's already very limited. So the question is asked, whether it's dichotomous or like a Likert scale, it's very clear. But for open-ended, it's a bit not so clear. Now, we want to look at the advantages and disadvantages of particularly three types of questionnaire instruments, which are the personal interview, the questionnaire, and the phone interview. So for personal interview, what are the advantages? Of course, personal interview are those ones where you go and sit down with somebody, with a respondent, and then the person is responding to questions. Sometimes you are allowed to ask follow-up questions depending on the responses. So an interview is usually done in a more relaxed mode than a questionnaire. So what are the advantages then? You're able to The interviewer is able to reduce respondent anxiety and allay potential embarrassment. So in that comfortable environment, the questionnaire, the respondent is relaxed, and so can respond from a place of comfort, so that it does not answer questions based on that initial anxiety of who is this, why is this person asking me this question, what does the person want to do with it, and so on and so forth. So you build some level of trust because of the comfort and the way you relax, and the trust that you have built. The routing of questions is made easier due to the experience of the interview. So you can afford to tailor-made questions because you're asking specific questions. It's just like when a journalist goes to ask a key government official some questions. Those questions will be particular to him. Sometimes they even go beyond the job to ask personal life questions. So that's the benefit of a personal interview. Unlike a questionnaire where everybody is being asked the same question. And sometimes it may or may not apply to the person that you're asking. And then you have to manage that. Variability may be reduced in the way that responses are recorded. That's true, because when you ask personal interview questions, you are asking, especially if you're asking to respondents that are in a particular uh, system, then they may tend to answer in the same way. And once they answer in the same way, the variables, the extent to which the responses are different may reduce. And that is a key thing in quantitative research that will be seen. Because when you want to ask questions, you want your variable or your indicator to have different responses. Now I'm not talking about the open-ended one. I'm talking about having quantitative data. Remember what we said about having quantitative or categorical data. So when the data is quantitative, it varies, the frequency varies, and usually in regressions, it helps the output. Less skill is required since the ways of recording are standardized. So you don't need to be taking you don't need a very good, yeah, to some extent you still need an expert who would ask questions and be able to follow up well, but not as much skill as in a questionnaire where you have to take the responses, you have to take the answers, you have to record the answers. So, so that's it. Pictures, signs, and objects can be used. Yes, in a personal interview, you have the room to show pictures, show signs, and then they can even point to one or the other or explain, talk to the pictures that you're using. Sincerity of responses can be checked more easily. Very important because there you have the opportunity to ask full, what do you call the control questions. So when you ask control questions, your ability to weigh the person's objectiveness or sincerity of responses is high. And also, because you're looking at the person's what do you call it, countenance, you're able to tell whether if this person is why is he fidgeting, is his response really genuine and all that. The respondent is available, the respondent is there. You're not struggling with whether the respondent will respond to the question or not, because of course you have booked the interview um, well in advance, and you go, and it's a mutual agreement to meet maybe 10, 15, 20 minutes depending on the length of the question, the interview, and you're able to ask your questions. Disadvantages: it can be time consuming because for each person you're asking questions and following up, and then the person is in relaxed mode, then you can imagine you spend up to 30 minutes, 1 hour in some cases with one personal interview before you go to the next. Higher costs involved per completed interview because of the time. So you'd find that in a day, an enumerator may just be able to do 1 or 2 personal interviews. But of course, you still have to pay them for a day, which means if you are targeting 100 interviews, for example, usually personal interviews are smaller than questionnaires. But if you are targeting 100, it simply tells you the number of days and the number of enumerators that you would have to hire. Questionnaires, it can be difficult to design, yeah, because you want to tailor made it to the respondents, then it becomes more tricky. No anonymity. So the usually you when you're doing a questionnaire, the practice is we don't want to do anything with your name or your office. We just want these responses. But that is not the case of personal interviews because of course you know the person you're going to, and in fact in some cases you want the person's portfolio or profile to be reflected in your report. So there is no or limited anonymity. Questions on sensitive issues may not be receive the correct response. That's true because you're looking at the person there, and the person is when you're asking somebody a question that is you're facing the person, their responses may not be objective. It's different from when somebody, and also because there's no anonymity, the person may not answer correctly. The person will give you what we call a politically correct response, which may not be which will not be the true reflection of things. Telephone interviews, of course, this one is straightforward. The responses are rapid because, of course, when you're on phone, you want to get it over with. You can cover a wide geographical area, which of course reduces cost. You have easier questions, easier to ask questions of sensitive nature. There's no anonymity. The person picking up the phone knows that you only know their number. But more importantly, the person can simply answer. They give you the truth about sensitive issues because you're not there looking at him and trying to understand where he's coming from and all that. So the literature shows that telephone interviews are able to give more true reflection of things, even when they are sensitive. So disadvantages, only people who have phones can respond. That's obvious since it's a telephone interview. It's not possible to use pictures or show cards, of course. There's higher refusal rate. You just pick up somebody, and I think I've also done that a couple of times. Somebody just calls you from the bank or from wherever, and you're in the middle of work or a meeting, and you just, can you call later? And sometimes it's in another meeting. So it's difficult to get somebody to sit down and either answer to the questions or even more so give you a personal interview. Sincerity of answer cannot be checked. Even though we say it has a higher likelihood of getting sincere answers, because you are not there with the person, you cannot, it's difficult to also check whether they are responding sincerely. Identity of person is unknown. So likely just the number, and even the number, yes, you would argue that the numbers are registered, but if you're asking so many people so many questions, then it reduces the issue of anonymity that the personal interviews have. Interviews must be short because you don't want to keep somebody on phone for long. The cost of keeping somebody on phone for long is also something you want to consider, and the time available. So you must make sure that it's short, and that may be counterproductive to some of the real intention of the questions, and may also tamper with the meaning of those questions. Finally, the advantages and disadvantages of questionnaires themselves. So now, questionnaires are the common ones where you have a list of questions, and there are so many of them. Let's say 300 or even 100, and then now you have to ask maybe individuals or households or firms these questions. So the regular common questionnaire instrument. And so the advantages will be one, the cost per respondent is likely to be less, right? Because it's quicker, unlike the personal interviews. So each enumerator can end up filling 5 to 10 questionnaires in a day, depending on their expertise and speed and all that. So more questions can also be asked, unlike in the phone interview. Since you have a questionnaire, you can ask more questions, but remember, you don't want to have too long a questionnaire. The interview cannot influence any respondents. The interviewer cannot influence any respondents, especially if you don't have need for interpretation of ambiguous questions, which means the questions that are there are clear enough, so each respondent is simply expected to fill in the questionnaire. So usually it's done in two ways. Is the one you give the respondent the questionnaire to fill, maybe filling there or going back and filling and then you come back and take it the next day, or the one where they are responding and you're answering. Usually it's determined, these are things that are determined in the sampling frame and discussed during the training of the enumerators. But either ways, if the capturing is done well, then the responses will be tailored to the questions, and the respondent's subjectiveness is not seen. Questions on sensitive issues may be asked and answered easily. Because of the anonymity, people feel free to answer to some of these questions. There'll be nothing like Dennis said ABCD, and so he should be arrested because of his alignment or thinking orientation. A large amount of responses is obtained in a short amount of time. This is synonymous to having more questions or more people covered between in a short space of time, because of course the questionnaires are straight to the point, and an interviewee, also an enumerator, can ask as many questions as possible because it covers less time. Low response rate. So um, usually you have 30%. The response rate is low because you have people, they have to consent to this questionnaire, which means they have to create time, Unlike the phone interview where you just ask them, you just call. Usually questionnaires also have low response rate because you have to ask them, are you willing to answer? Sit down and answer. We have 5 minutes to 10 minutes to answer this questionnaire, and then the you find that it's an issue. Also, they can even accept to answer, and then in the middle of the questionnaire they have a sensitive question, and then they have to bail out. So, unlike personal interviews where for an official knows that you're looking for him in particular, the questionnaire has one issue, one problem, which is that it knows that you can afford to ask any other person that question. So if you can meet another person, please do meet another person. I don't have time for this. That's where the low response rate comes from. Questionnaires may only be partly answered. So you may have a questionnaire, and that's one thing you should take note of when designing the questionnaire. So if you ask, like I've said, you ask sensitive questions at the end, you want to make sure that midway the person does not bail out. You preempt the person about the time well in advance so that and make sure that you stick to that time so that you don't have unanswered questions, because whether the person refuses to answer from the beginning or the person answers a question and midway you bail out, both becomes uh, um, questionnaires that you should discard and that you will not be able to use. Misunderstandings may not be clarified because the questions are there, and even when you try to make it as clear as possible, because of individual differences, the respondents may not be able to understand it very clearly. And now you have to depend on the respondent again to interpret, and even the respondent may not be able to interpret it to the understanding of the individual responses, the respondents rather. No encouragement to think more deeply about questions before answering them. It's not like in a personal interview where somebody is relaxed and you have all the time. Respondents are able to think about questions clearly and then answer, of course, knowing that their responses will have implications thereafter. So that's not the case, or that's hardly the case with the the personal interviews. Sorry, with the questionnaires, because even the respondent, the enumerator asking the questions, want to cover as many questions as possible. So taking more time usually is even telling the respondents, I want to continue, I want to continue. So even the respondents may not be helping the situation. But yeah, the questions are just there. You're expected to just maybe tick boxes or check or fill spaces, maybe without necessarily really giving thorough thought to what the question really wants and the logic behind the question. Yeah. So on this note, I think this is the end of this lecture. I'm not sure we'll be able to go into the other one. The lecture 3 is a bit technical, so I would prefer to have that in an interactive class where we can ask questions if we don't understand, and we'll be sure that we are following what we are doing collectively. So let me end here, and then we'll continue from lecture 3 in our next class. Thank you very much. Do enjoy your weekend.